Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of ours this afternoon on in the landscape stream, landscape approach, governance and tenure in landscape approaches to REDD+. Maybe we just give a second for people to come in. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, once again to this session. This afternoon, we'll start off with the stream landscape approaches, and we're talking about governance and tenure in landscape approaches to REDD+. I'll start with just a quick, thought of mine. I think when one of the first presentations we made on landscape approaches to REDD+ in one of the UNFCCC meetings, after the session had finished, one of the negotiators came up to me and said, Peter, this was a very nice presentation, and we seem to be convinced that landscape approaches are useful. Because the drivers of deforestation are partly and mostly originate from outside the forest. But, how do we operationalize landscape approaches? That was his main question. And he said to me, because, in my country, who's going to run the landscape approaches? Is it going to be the Ministry of Forestry, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Planning? Which ministry? And he said to me, many times we've got these ministries having different plans. The Ministry of Environment is doing REDD+, plans for REDD+, while at the same time the Ministry of Agriculture is making land deals with oil palm companies to come and open up oil palm plantations. How do we resolve that, in operationalizing, landscape approaches? And he said to me, that my country is a Francophone country, and when you look at decentralization in Africa, in Francophone countries, it's relatively not so easy, and at the level of landscape that you're talking about, there is very little autonomy to make decisions about landscapes, as opposed to Anglophone countries in Africa. So all of this, he said to me, I really want to understand how we operationalize landscapes, and I think these policy questions, these institutional questions, these questions about, where power lies in the systems are the sorts of questions that we want to handle within the governance framing this evening. Yeah? And we've got a very eminent panel in front of us this afternoon. We've got Rahima Jaidi from the Executive Director of the Community Forest Management Network in Jumita in Tanzania. Very long experience on these issues. We've got Kanti Risal, who's the manager on gender, poverty, and equity, and multi-stakeholder forestry program in STDC SSU in Nepal. We've got with us Adriana Ramos, who's the deputy executive secretary for the Instituto Socioambiental in Brazil. And we've got with us Ademola Briamo, who's the Senior National Resources Management Specialist on Agriculture and Ecosystem Services at the World Bank. Thank you very much for taking your time to come to talk to us about this. We'll start off by giving them some time to throw out some thoughts. I'll just prompt them to throw out some thoughts, and then that will start up the discussions. You've got 4 minutes each to talk about, to throw out a few thoughts. Rahima, I think you heard this morning the minister talking about, and there were some issues about, local level planning and how that links up to REDD+, and sort of the rights issues around governance. Can you share some thoughts with us, please?
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much for also giving me this opportunity to participate in this very useful event. And I'll try to speak very slowly for the sake of the interpreters and my fellow colleagues. Yes, I heard today in the previous session that local planning and issues of rights and issues of governance also came up in that session. And I think that it's true that rights, if are not well incorporated in this whole aspect of REDD, it's not going to work. And it's not going to work for the communities, and it's not going to work for the environment in general. So I think we understand that at the landscape level, we have very different groups of people who use the landscape in various uses. That comes up to bring about the challenges and conflicts that we see. Maybe even in Tanzania, we have a lot of conflict rising out of competing land uses for pastoralists, for farmers. So that is the whole issue that's coming up. So I think the only way to solve this problem is to undergo community land use planning. And this in Tanzania is a very important aspect in our national laws and policies. And it's mandatory for every village to come up with community land use planning. That way, the communities can really define which area is for pastoralism, which area is for forest reserve, and which area is for other common economic activities. And that way, we reduce this kind of tension in the forest, in our villages. But again, you have to make sure that this process is as much participatory as possible to make sure that all sectors, there's effective coordination between the sectors which are involved. For example, the forest sector, the agriculture sector, even the mining sector, as well as the communities who are the ones who are going to determine the future use of these resources, for them to be able to take part in this process. And we see that there's a lot of competing land uses because of the rapid population growth in Tanzania. So people are using that land to expand for settlement, expand for agriculture. So the only way to make sure that these resources are used effectively and sustainably is to come up with land use planning. And Tanzania has a very good guideline on participatory land use planning that it's been applied. But again, you're speaking of Tanzania, which is a very huge country, more than 10,000 villages. So, and the process for land use planning is a very expensive process, takes a long time. So very few villages have managed to come up to have these plans in place. But having the land use plans is not the end of it. You should have bylaws at the local level, which will now try to make sure that the plans are effectively enforced to deter actions that will not really go in line with what the communities have agreed on. Thank you, Peter.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think very, very instructive, very useful thoughts. We'll come back to you in a few minutes. Kanti, just to go back to some of the linking to what she's talking about. I think one of the big points that we might need to think about at the landscape level, looking at gender issues, especially some of your experiences from Nepal within community forestry. Any thoughts? No?
Thank you very much. First of all, inviting me in this important forum. And I'm very happy to see that, particularly in this session, the forum is more than gender balance. And I'm very happy to see this. To your question, Nepal is already famous all over the world and leading this, the community in terms of community management of the forest. Out of 39% of the forest in Nepal, 25% of the forest is managed by the community-based regimes of community-based forest management. Community forestry, leasehold forestry, joint government and community forest, collaborative forest. So there are various modalities even within the community management of forest, and Nepal is leading in that. So within that context, as this particular session is about how to role of gender in landscape management. First of all, just want to give some background as Nepal is already submitted its REDD plan in 2010 to Forest Carbon Partnership Facility World Bank under the World Bank program, and it is in the process of developing this REDD plus strategy is now in the development process. So we have moved forward in terms of setting up various institutional mechanism for developing this strategy based on the REDD plan. And we are also moving ahead with the MRB system and the safeguards. But despite of this progress in setting up this institution and safeguards, from the gender perspective, we have to say that even within the safeguards, gender-specific standards and safeguards have not been developed well within the safeguard development process. It has been like overlooked or neglected area. As I found during my research, that the same case with other countries also. Gender-specific standards are not there within the safeguards, and it has not been mainstream in the other components of the REDD plus strategy and plan as well. So this is a gap someone working in the field of gender and poverty equity, which we have been critically failed, and we have to still work more, even at the landscape level and also at the national and subnational level. Still more to be done, and I'll come back again.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to some of the issues that you just raised. Adriana, now if you look at some of the things that have been happening in Brazil, we heard this morning about the interesting cases. I think Gustavo cited some of the interesting work that is being done at the indigenous forest level. What have been the right issues around that, which we all know are part of the whole Brazilian forest discourse at that sort of landscape level? Yes, please. I think you can. Yeah.
So, thanks for the opportunity. I think that in Brazil, since 1999, several studies have shown the importance of indigenous territories for the protection of the forest. But it's not necessary to read this. If you take a look at the map and you see deforestation in red and indigenous territories in this orange and other protected areas in green, we will see clearly that there are some states like Rondônia, for example, and like in this region of Mato Grosso and Pará, in which the main areas of forest that are stand are indigenous territories. So the map shows clearly the whole of these indigenous territories in conserving forests. And the establishment of these territories together with other protected areas was a key strategy for the reduction of deforestation that Brazil achieved in the Amazon. Indigenous lands in Brazil are protected by the Constitution that says that the property of the land is from the state federal level in the government. But indigenous people have the exclusive use of all natural resources inside this. And this, even if we don't have a regulation, it's a common understanding that it includes also carbon. This perspective, if we get Brazil as an example, the recognition of these rights can be in itself a strategy, an important strategy to reduce deforestation. The only exception in Brazil in terms of the exclusive use of the territories for indigenous people is the undersoil, it's especially mining. And now there is one of our huge challenges to guarantee that the maintenance of this landscape is a strategy for conserving forests. Our Congress now, together with our government, is discussing the legislation to allow mining inside the indigenous territories. The point is that this is being discussed as if it was an economic alternative for indigenous people, but at the same time, we don't have the REDD strategy, we don't have the regulation for REDD or for the other kinds of management inside indigenous territories. So we think that this, for example, could be a huge struggle, because if we are allowed to make mining inside these territories without having the regulation for having other activities that can be much more sustainable, then we will put under pressure all these territories. And it's important to say that we also have, for these regions, a huge struggle considering the infrastructure projects, and especially if we think about this corridor of Xingu that I want you to pay attention in it, because I will show later more detailed issues. We have here the Belo Monte Dam, which is the biggest dam that is being built in the South America, which will affect directly some territories around, and which is in the same landscape. And for us, when we think about the landscape approach, we have to think about the whole landscape. We cannot share a piece of the territory for one activity and others for others. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Adriana, for being really brief and on time, really. Ademola, you're from the bank, yeah? And you heard a lot of these stories about the rights and the gender and all of these things. But one of the big things that comes up, you know, in some of the issues we discuss around where are the investments to do these kinds of things, looking at everything, as Adriana mentioned? How do we manage that?
Okay, thanks very much, moderator. Now, when you talk about integrated landscapes, we are talking about meeting multiple objectives, just like Adriana has just mentioned. Those multiple objectives can include food security, water and energy security, biodiversity conservation, land management, etc., etc. So what this implies, therefore, is that we have to think of an integrated solution. What we have experienced in the past is that different sectors, different governments and government departments tend to manage their portfolio exclusively. But the time has come for this kind of approach to change. There has to be an integrated platform to manage natural resources. And so the starting point, that's one of the things we advocate in the bank, is that there has to be a multi-agency platform and collaboration to access finance, public, private, climate finance, etc. So that's the first thing that we have to recognize. So the second thing that we need to recognize is that promoting landscape solutions will require us an innovative thinking, a situation in which we try to take cognizance of the value, the total ecosystem values provided by the different sectors of the landscape into consideration. We used to focus primarily on agricultural productivity, or water production, as water services, as the case may be. But this has to change. We have to start looking at climate regulation. We have to start looking at adaptation. We have to start looking at resilience building. We have to start looking at carbon sequestration on farmlands. And we have to start looking at the ways in which we integrate the rural interland to the markets where the services are really needed. So these are some of the issues that we take headlong at the bank. And we have various examples which I can provide as time goes on. So we have examples, for instance, in Ethiopia, where we have the Rift Valley systems in which farmer regeneration techniques was used to rehabilitate large expanse of land. We have another example in the Lowest Plateau in which 2.5 million farmers participated and have their fortune turned around. We have other examples in Colombia. We have other examples in Albania. So all of these are pointing to the fact that we need to manage ecosystems in an integrated manner. There's no room for silos, no room for planning the resources all alone, be it the agricultural department or the environment sector or the water resources sector, as the case may be. An integrated planning is what is required, and that is what will help us meet the challenges of the current moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ademola. Very, very interesting thoughts. We will come back to some of those issues. Rahima, you mentioned about the land use planning being very important and the bylaws that are developed being the key within the whole local planning process. What are some of these bylaws? How can you give us examples of how these bylaws link to the REDD strategy in itself? What is the interaction between these bylaws at the moment that result from land use planning and the National REDD strategy within your community forestry approach?
Thank you, Peter. The bylaws that I'm talking about here are bylaws in general at the village level, which try to say exactly how this particular resource is going to be used by the communities. But speaking of the Jumita and TFCG REDD project, where we are facilitating as well the land use planning process. So we tried to integrate issues of REDD into it. So this is a bit different, but we used the government guideline, but again, trying to link it with what REDD is all about and climate change in general. So that is the link that we have in the bylaws in the REDD aspect in Tanzania. But again, we are talking about the national REDD strategy, the Tanzania one. We are also talking about the Tanzania REDD Plus safeguards that we just developed recently. All these instruments try to talk exactly about the importance of land use planning in Tanzania. So they're trying to make sure that for every program that's going to be implemented in a particular village, they should facilitate land use planning, because this is the only way to make sure that the resources are going to be used in a wise and sustainable manner for the benefit of the future generation as well as the coming generation. So each village has its own circumstances different from the other village. So they all sit together at the village level, the village assembly, trying to agree on what issues should they incorporate in their bylaws. And these bylaws, actually, they have the very same enforcement mandate, just like any other law in Tanzania, but they operate at the local level. So whoever contravenes them has to face the law. So I think in that way we can make sure that the communities are not infringed of their rights, because based on this is where you can determine or you can safeguard the community's rights, especially those marginalized groups, the vulnerable groups we're talking here. You talked about gender issues, so all these are really taken care of in the bylaws to make sure that everybody in that particular society, in that particular communities, is benefiting from the resources. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Kanti, we read a lot about the benefits of community forestry to women, in the communities in Nepal. A lot of your work shows that. Why is it that within the national REDD strategy, gender wasn't really taken into account when a lot of it is highly linked to the success story of community forestry, quote unquote, in Nepal?
Well, this is a very interesting question. We have been we're working for the donors, particularly from my position, I'm saying. And we are also working with the civil society and community forest user groups and the NGOs also. Their federation, with them also we work. So we are a multi-stakeholder program, so we'll work with the various stakeholders at the same time, with the government, with the community, and with the NGOs. So you can see that this multi-stakeholder forestry program approach itself is like, as you say, that we need to work with the different stakeholders in the community management of forest is the strongest in Nepal. So they are part of the REDD. We have a civil society consultation group who used to give advice to the government. Since government is in the steering leading role, should be in the leading role for the REDD plus strategy development process. This civil society, this consultation group used to give the advices, suggestion, and they used to consult them. But I think there might be some gap in the building the already successful case stories from the community forestry that women has been managing and using forest resources from last 25, 30 years in the community forest of Nepal. So those success stories, there is some kind of gap. And we have to do some in-depth analysis and study why this gap is happening. Since the Federation of Community Forest Group is also there in the CSO consultation group, why are not they raising the issues of this gender integration within the standards and throughout the whole REDD plus strategy development processes? Because lessons are already there that women are the successful user and managers of the forest in Nepal, particularly in the case of community forestry. So there is some lack of maybe some lack of strong advocacy from the maybe women working in the community forestry. Maybe I can see that there is a gap there. Maybe the gender, those who are working on the gender professionals, like myself also, we need to work in collaboration with the community forest user groups and women rights groups, and strongly in collaboration and with the government also. So those kind of linkages and alliances, maybe that gap is there, which is not sufficiently bringing the success of the story of the community management. And there, 50% of women are in the community management groups. I mean, we have 18,000 community management forest in Nepal and more than 29,000 different modalities of community-based forest management groups in Nepal. So, and it is more than 40% of the population engaged in the community-based management of the forest. So, considering this huge potential of this community management of forest and those lessons, how to integrate those successes in the REDD plus strategy making process, that gap is already there. Maybe we are seeing forest from the REDD plus perspective that forest only as a carbon sink. It is not only a carbon sink.
Okay.
So the multiple benefits of community management of forest and the benefits it brings, so institution building at the local level. You see that more than 29,000 groups at the community level. It's a huge asset for the sustainability of REDD Plus program. I mean, when you start generating carbon credits and when the issue of benefit distribution and others will come, this institutional and look at the local level will be the very strong assets that the government have to utilize properly. And that's not happening. Maybe some gap is there. We have to do the analysis and work together.
But that's some homework for you, right? So we'll
but
have
we have
to
been
talk
already raising
about
these issues. I mean,
okay, good. Okay, thank you. We'll have some time to interact with people on that. Thank you very much, Adriana. Just to go back to your story from Brazil, you said that the rights issues are strongly enshrined in the whole institutional policy process in Brazil. How did that happen? How did you manage to get that really working? Because in other parts, in the Congo Basin where I come from, it's not really the case. How can Congo Basin countries, how can Tanzania learn from your experience? How did you do it? And what can you tell your colleagues from the Congo Basin, from Tanzania, from Nepal? How do you enshrine that, and how do you make use of that within the REDD process?
Okay, thank you, Peter. I think that the first thing is that although we have the Constitution, although the Constitution has managed to guarantee a lot of, at least 20% of the Amazon recognized as indigenous territory, it doesn't mean that it's completely guaranteed.
Exactly.
First of all, because we have a strong struggle now against indigenous rights in Brazil, with a lot of projects in the Congress and the pressure from the government to change it. We are in a moment in which our economy has grown a lot basically in primary industries. So the agribusiness sector, the mining sector are putting a lot of pressure over these guarantees, these territorial guarantees. Besides the indigenous territories, Constitution also recognized, for example, communities like the Quilombolas, which are the former slaves, black communities in Brazil. They also have the right to the land, but the process of recognition of these lands are really stopped for several months. And now we have other kinds of projects like the one I said in terms of mining. So the sustainable use of these territories are also under threat. So when we had the Constitution, we had a strong mobilization of civil society in Brazil because we were in the process of democratization. And the majority of the things that we achieved as rights in the Constitution was result of this mobilization. Now we are trying to come together again to guarantee the maintenance of these rights and to guarantee that we can increase these rights and then we can have real policies for guaranteeing the sustainable use of the forest. And one of the big challenges we have is based on the perspective of long-term or short-term investments. I think that indigenous people from Colombia have raised a very important approach when they talk about their plans of life. So we think that besides the guaranteeing of territorial rights, we have also to guarantee the perspective of have long-term plans for these communities that are managing these areas in a proper way to think about their future in the same way. And instead, what we are seeing is that the political power put a lot of pressure with very short-term initiatives that are going against this perspective of sustainability.
Okay, thank you very much. Ademola, you mentioned, you emphasized a lot about integrated, coordinated planning, looking at models that bring. We know, we've looked at 65 cases, around the world of readiness, where no government at all is making any budgetary allocation for REDD Plus, for example. Yeah? We know that at $5 a ton, you are not going to get enough money to invest in all of these multiple services that you're talking about. There is very little source for, money for, biodiversity, water, and all of that. And you mentioned quite some cases that were purportedly successful. What are these models? How can we, in reality, develop this sort of public-private partnerships that you mentioned? I'm sure, I don't know if Mike Koczynski is in the room, one of the private sectors, but how do you develop that sort of model, and how do you mobilize those resources that are needed for doing this sort of complex, integrated stuff? Because it's costly.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, the first thing we have to realize is this. The local land users, generally speaking, tend to be the primary investor in land resources. A study by FAO recently corroborated that, in which we found that the investment by local farmers totally dwarfs public spending and ODA assistance altogether. And with ODA assistance leveling off, the countries will have to increasingly turn to the private sector to finance natural resources management. There's no doubt concerning that. Now, what are the examples that we have? Now, a very good example is in Vietnam, where we have Unilever going into the tea sector, helping the country to develop quality, helping the country to develop the value chain of tea. And this has helped a great deal in uplifting the tea sector in that country. Now, in the World Bank, we have the IFC going into Zambia, helping to develop conservation agriculture. Now, when you look at conservation agriculture, you find out that there can be several players, ranging from the very large farm owners to the smallholders, with just 1.5 to 2 hectares. So the key issue there is developing innovative solutions in terms of no-tillage techniques. So IFC is trying to help farmers in Zambia to help develop this kind of solutions. But taken together, what are the lessons that we learn to enable the private sector be a major player? Number one, there has to be locally negotiated tenure systems, land tenure systems, regulations, as well as land use plans and user rights. Without that, the private sectors will not be able to do anything. Secondly, because we're talking about public-private partnership, the public has to be committed to investing in productivity-enhancing research and development. Now, when we are talking about some of these sustainable land management techniques, you know that they tend to be complementary. For instance, if you are talking about maybe innovative seeds, maybe fertilizer, and so on and so forth, without roads, with that enables the farmers to link to the market. How are you going to do it? So investment in public goods would be necessary from the part of the government. Then let me leave one more example, and that is in the area of research or in the area of breeding.